Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, the podcast where we look into the life and the work of the philosopher Karl Popper. And we have a remarkable guest today. If you pick up any book on Karl Popper and run through the edited chapters and look at the names, you're going to come across this man's name. I've done it a number of times in my own reading, and it's always interesting to read his work and always interesting to look into those details. So it is such a pleasure to have on the podcast today, Jagdish Hattiangadi. Jagdish, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Well, happy to be here.
It's my pleasure. And before we get into, we're going to talk about induction, Francis Bacon, Thomas Kuhn, as well as Karl Popper. But before we get into all of that, I might start with a question about your personal interactions with Popper and with Kuhn, because you knew them both, you studied with them both, I believe. So as a first question, how did you know them both and how did you find them both philosophically and personally as well?
Popper I found philosophically when I was an undergraduate. I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I thought Popper had a way out of what looked like an impasse in epistemology. As described, for example, by Ayer's problems of philosophy, the problems of, what was it called? Ayer's book. Anyway, problems of induction. Now, the issue was this. I had an option to go to Oxford to study with Gilbert Ryle. He was at Magdalen College, or I could go to the London School of Economics. And to everyone's surprise, I went to the LSE because Popper was there. I rushed to get there. Then I found when I got there that he was in sabbatical. But he did come back the following year, and he took me under his wing, and we used to meet every week that he was in term. He would come once a day to LSE, and he would meet with me and with David Miller, his other student, and we would both spend an hour each with Popper just talking about whatever it is that we had on our minds. Then I met Kuhn because I wrote my MA thesis on Kuhn. In that very first year that Popper was back, Kuhn's structure had just come out. And I read a paper on Kuhn's structure, somewhat critical of it, but also very appreciative. And Popper suggested that I study with him for a master's degree, with him as the supervisor. And J.O. Wisdom, who was looking after me, who was my advisor the year before, would be the second supervisor. And of course, when I finished my master's in 1965, there was a large conference in London organized by Imre Lakatos, and the proceedings, or some of the proceedings of the session on Kuhn were published in a book called Rationality and the Growth of Knowledge, which was published by Lakatos and Musgrave. So when Kuhn came there, I met him. But even prior to that, I had applied to study at Princeton, and I had got the admission. So meeting Kuhn was not the reason why I went to study with him. It was because of his book and because I wanted to study the history of science, which I could get for 5 years at Princeton because they gave me fellowships to study there. In England, I was there on loans, which I had taken for myself to study with Popper. At the end of the 3 years, Popper offered me 2 part-time lecturerships, one at LSE, one at Chelsea College, where he arranged with a friend of his to give it to me. But I was not keen on staying on in London because the effort of teaching 2 different part-time jobs would have been much greater than the effort of studying a whole new field, the history of science. I had studied some physics, but not its history. So I went there to study with Kuhn. But then I didn't actually ask Kuhn to be my dissertation supervisor because I was somewhat critical of some of the things he said in the structure. I remained critical, you might say. So it was a problem because Kuhn was somewhat defensive about his opinions, and I didn't want to clash. So I asked Hempel and Grandy to be my supervisors at Princeton, and it was in the philosophy of science rather than in the history and philosophy of science.
Can I ask you just about that? Because often people will tell me that Popper was very defensive about his opinions, but you're saying Kuhn was very defensive. So did you find Popper to be a defensive man as well, or was Kuhn's defensiveness a different type and a different level and a different type of emotive feeling to it?
In Popper's case, he felt misunderstood. So he was very upset if people attributed to him views that he did not hold. So very early on, he proposed a theory of the demarcation between science and philosophy of science and metaphysics. And he was interpreted by people who did philosophy in a linguistic manner to be proposing a theory of meaning. And he had no intention of proposing a theory of meaning. He didn't think those were important, and he was upset when that continued for, 15 years to be his calling card, that he had proposed the falsifiability theory of meaning. So he became very defensive about that. So I acknowledge that. He was also very touchy about certain topics on which he thought people are being intellectually dishonest. He would get very angry with people who said things which were pompous or other way. But I should tell you that as a student, when I used to meet him for 1 hour, we had free-ranging discussions of all kinds of topics. And he was surprisingly open-minded. Surprisingly. I mean, we discussed Sartre, we discussed Nietzsche, we discussed Bernard Shaw, we discussed all sorts of people, Russell. And he was extremely open-minded. He would discuss things. But when it came to public criticism, he was very keen that people get him right. That was his way. Kuhn was different. Kuhn was defensive about his thesis altogether. So one of the things that we discussed very early on is whether his theory of crisis, Kuhn thought that every revolution is preceded by a crisis. Whether his theory of crisis applies to Einstein's special theory of relativity. I didn't think it did, and I still don't think it does. There was no crisis. The crisis came after Einstein published his paper. That created the crisis. But prior to that, there was an intellectual issue which was discussed by Poincaré, it was discussed by Lawrence and Fitzgerald, and various people had done experimental work on it. Michelson and Morley, Troughton and Noble, a whole bunch of people had written about it, but there was no crisis. There was no sense of impending change that I can see in any of the literature. So Kuhn's response to that was very defensive. That's what bothered me. And I found that, so I thought that if I did my dissertation with him, it would be a battle rather than a collaboration. I may have misjudged it, it's hard to tell. But that was my judgment, and that's why I didn't ask him to be my supervisor.
Well, from that, there's interesting stories. Let's jump into the philosophy itself, because in some ways here we're going to shoot down Popper and Kuhn and do so in the defense of Francis Bacon. And I find this really interesting. I spoke to Anthony O'Hare last episode in the podcast, and I thought he was fascinating on the topic, similar to this. So let's get into it. You write that, of course, Karl Popper and Kuhn both didn't give induction any any validity whatsoever. And you go on to say that this opened up a space that gave the belittlers of science an opening to undermine scientific research and the social acceptability of science. So I might open that up to you as a starting point. How, I guess, what is induction as well, and why did Popper and Kuhn disagree with it and give it no standing? But why did this open up this dangerous space for people to attack science?
Well, in Popper's case, he was worried all along about conventionalism. Because conventionalism, or the doctrine that scientific theories are true by convention, has the consequence that we can decide which theory is true by having an agreement on it. And you'll recall that Popper lived through the awful interwar period when the German political development of the rise of Nazism, they made the idea central to their doctrine that they will determine what the truth is. That it doesn't matter if a theory is called a lie, so long as it's big enough, then it takes over. That's the theory of the big lie. And of course, they did that with the diagnosis of the First World War, which they said was lost because Jewish interests had let down Germany, the international. And so there was this thing about nationalism versus internationalism. And Popper was therefore a great defender of truth being independent of our social arrangements. Now, if you say that, as Poincaré does in his book, Science and Hypothesis, that the principles of physics are true in the sense that they are conventionally agreed upon as true by all the physicists, this is a disaster, because it means that physics is then just what we call reality in physics is just a convention that physicists have employed. So if they employ that physics, then they could just as well employ another physics. If you have this science, you could just as well change your mind and have another science as far as the world is concerned. And if you take that, then it means that can be many kinds of science. And that's also a part of the war, the Second World War, the issues preceding the Second World War, to which Popper reacted very strongly. Namely, that there is no German science and Jewish science. There may be many influences, English, French, German, Jewish, whatever. But science is an attempt to find out about reality and has nothing to do with which group is studying it. So he was against it. But the way it comes out is that if you admit that science is a social convention, then consensus defines it. And this becomes a factor because Kuhn suggests that what distinguishes science from non-science is that science, there are there are certain periods of time when consensus dictates what the experts consider reality. But Kuhn didn't go on to say that it determines it forever. It admits that there is such a thing as reality. He just thinks that over time, we have periods when a certain take on it, reality, is established as a consensus. That's normal science. So in both their cases, they leave open this possibility that reality is only what we say it is. And we can choose to say what we want by making sufficient corrections in the rest of our beliefs. And this is very dangerous for political thought, which bothered Popper. It's also, I think, not true. I mean, that's another matter. But remember, Kuhn was a student of James Bryant Conant. the president of Harvard. And one of their tasks was to disseminate science as a humanity, which was like an adventure of ideas. It's a very liberal conception of what science is. The last thing that group who were in Harvard wanted to do was to undermine science as a description of reality. So both Popper and Kuhn had a strong interest. Their values were to understand science as a very valiant attempt to understand truth, reality, in the face of great epistemological difficulty. The truth is hidden in the deep and all that. But they both, I think, provided interesting descriptions of science. But if you take these descriptions seriously, then the conventionalists gain ground.
Well, let's get into that. Let's get into the interesting parts of this. This is going to be good. So let's talk about Bacon now. And very early on in your work, you write how badly Popper, and I think Kuhn as well, perhaps, I think he wrote that he followed Popper in this in some ways, that they both get Bacon quite wrong. They make allusions between Bacon's induction and Lockean empiricism.
Well, yes, this is an old identification. Neither Popper nor Kuhn are responsible for it. They are victims of it. That's my reading of it. Because the history of methodology from the 18th century confused empiricism and experimentalism. Experimentalism was Boyle's way of describing Baconian induction. And the Royal Society took up what they call the experimental philosophy in 1660. It's in their charter, the experimental philosophy. And the Royal Society of London met regularly, and all these experimentalists would gather together and do what I see as Baconian things, but which in the 18th century came to be interpreted as empiricist. And there is a fundamental difference between empiricism and experimentalism, which was patched over. And I'm currently working on why they were patched over, which is not in the paper that we're discussing. But the difference is that in empiricism, there's a foundation, namely our perceptions. Empiricism looks at our experience and looks for those elements in it, sense experience, which are, in some sense, unchallengeable. If I see a patch of pink, then I see a patch of pink. You can't say I saw another kind of a patch. My perception of this pink, even the thing itself is not pink, it's actually gray. You know, they have these perceptual studies of how yellow and gray bananas are looked at, so it's possible that there's a gray banana which I see as yellow. That's possible. But there's no doubt that when I see yellow, even though it's a gray banana, I actually have the visual perception, the sensation of yellow. It's unchallengeable. And if you take that as the data of science, then you can't have any questioning of the data. The questioning all becomes of how you interpret the data. Whereas Bacon's entire program of induction, it was a whole program, he had the Great Instauration, was based on the errors of perception. His whole theory was that you collect these errors and you find the right theory by an analysis of the errors. That's the main difference between empiricism and experimentalism. Sorry, I didn't.
No, that's good. I was just going to respond to that with something that you wrote, and you speak about the error, or perhaps the ways in which Popper and Bacon perhaps have been misunderstood over the years. You say Popper speaks, when he speaks about error and learning from error, as you mentioned there, he talks about hypotheses and conjectures and guesses in his own language. And Bacon tends to speak about errors in appearance and perceptual appearance. And I might get you to unpack that for us, because many people listening, many Popperians listening will think perhaps there's no real difference between the two things here in some ways, that if we imagine that everything we see is theory laden, then is there a difference? And what is it?
Well, this is the crux of the matter. If you take and to understand this, we have to understand it against the background of the skeptics. When I write about my book, I spend a lot of time discussing three kinds of skepticism: Socratic, Platonic, and the Pyrrhonian. If you take the Pyrrhonian skeptic for now, they say that you can live by the appearances, or you can live by apparent knowledge. You don't need to seek out what true knowledge is, what reality is. All you can live by is known to you as appearance, as apparent knowledge. So they decry the study of what we might call science or philosophy to discover what the reality is. As opposed to that, Bacon suggests that all the discrepancies of apparent knowledge that we have should be collected together and put into what he calls natural history. Then the main difference is this: if you take a hypothesis of the ancients, let's say atomism, and you find a difficulty in it, well, then you give up atomism and you take up another hypothesis. But you have gone no further than you did before, other than knowing that atomism fails. But when you refute something that you might say, known to you, something that is apparent knowledge, then the question becomes, what is the world like that things appear to you to be so, but it isn't so? Which is quite different from asking whether a speculative hypothesis is true. That's the main difference, is that when you question apparent knowledge, or when you question perceptual or trade knowledge of people have worked for years in a certain field and they've made certain assumptions, and they say, I know this, I know how this works. And then you show that it's a mistake. And that has a profound influence, because now you say, well, how is it that it worked all these years, even though it was a mistake? Mm. Whereas if you're told that there's an ancient theory of atomism, or an ancient theory of pores or an ancient theory of being and nothingness, coming from Parmenides, and you say, oh, I can give you 3 arguments against it. It's a nice story. So, you take part in it. But it doesn't allow you to interact with the things that you understand or you thought you understood from before. It's at a very high level of generality. Whereas when you start questioning appearances, then all of a sudden you have to interact with the things that appear to you to figure out what actually happened. And that's Bacon's great strength, that he asks us to, as he puts it, muck around in the particulars, that you have to work in the particulars, because that's where all your appearances are residing. That's where apparent knowledge is. So you think apparently that something is the case, it's because most likely it is the case. Moreover, if it appeared to be the case, and it turns out it's not the case, it is still true that there's something about the case there's something about that case which appeared to you as it did. So there is something about that reality which affords that particular appearance that it had. So for Bacon, he thought that the task is to always question the theory that you think is true, what is known to be true, what you think is known. This doesn't mean you only deal with particulars, it can also be very high level. And I think his account of it follows Plato. Plato does the same thing. If you look at Plato's development of Plato's thought, he discusses other people's views and criticizes them, usually in dialogues which deal with a number of theories, but among those are his own. And sometimes, if you look at the evidence, the greatest difficulties that Plato's theories faced were raised by Plato. The third man argument is out of Plato, even though Aristotle uses it. The point is that lots of theories that were entertained by Plato were entertained because he thought they were the best theories available. And the task of induction is to take the best hypotheses like that, but also take those things which you don't consider hypotheses, but consider to be patently true. Observations, things which seem perfectly true. And yet those, when you cross-question them, like a Socratic cross-questioner, that's Bacon. And if you find out that there are mistakes in there, then you have something really interesting about the way the world is organized that you have got hold of. That's his point.
So in some ways, Baconian induction is much more focused on error. So it's much more Popperian in some ways. It really is seeking out errors and getting, correct me if I'm wrong in this reading, and finding more value in the discovery of errors than the discovery of repetitions.
Yes, that's exactly right. He doesn't look for repetitions. He looks for errors. He says you look for outlandish things. Look for things which the tradespeople tell you that the philosophers are wrong about. And then you create tables in which, if you believe something has a certain nature, then on the left-hand side, you put down all those things in which the nature is exhibited. And on the right-hand side, in very similar circumstances where the nature is missing, tables of presence and absence. So he wants to bring out, you might say, the paradoxical character of all our apparent knowledge.
Please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Ask you.
Okay. I was just going to ask on that as well about certainty. Does Bacon think that we can gain certainty in any way?
Well, he thought that at any stage, he thought of science as a pyramid. And you rise up above the pyramid, and the method of induction applies at each pyramid, at each level of the pyramid. Now, it's possible that when you get to the top, you get certainty. He doesn't talk about that, but it's possible. But in fact, he warns us that we should never try to get right to the top, because he was a very religious man, and he thought that when you get right to the top of the pyramid, you're asking about how it is that God created the world, what purpose it was, and what the purpose of all things is. And he says, this is the kind of knowledge for which Adam was cast out of paradise. So we shouldn't try our luck there. So his picture of a pyramid is a pyramid with a very small pyramid at the top, which is removed, because only the Church of England can talk about that kind of knowledge based on scripture. And he thought we could go up to a certain point, and there we stop. Otherwise, we could end up by blaspheming, which is the one thing that he does not want to do. So whether we get to certainty is, I would say, Bacon would, if you had asked him, he would say, you never get to certainty. You always have fallible knowledge. So it's very much like Paul. And it has been already pointed out, these features, because Peter Urbach, who was also a student of Popper, he also taught at LSE after Popper retired. I think Peter is retired too now, Peter Urbach. He wrote a paper on Bacon as a precursor to Popper, in which notes down several of these similarities.
On a similar note there as well, let's talk about broken mirrors. And you've been talking a lot there about this complexity of the difficulty of observation and the constant seeking for discovery of errors and error correction. And Bacon has this wonderful analogy He talks about mirrors, a broken mirror, but also about lenses at some point, this idea of looking through different lenses. And this takes us a little bit towards what you mentioned at the start about his conventionalism, because you're right that he's talking about reality as always distorted and always as a perception and a challenge of the mind. And in some ways, you say that the word true in this context perhaps should be understood as faithful instead. So I might get you to take us there and explain what Bacon meant about his mirrors and his lenses, but also that different perception of what truth actually is.
Yes, I shouldn't give the impression that he talked a lot about mirrors and lenses, but it's a part of his statement also in particularly the advancement of learning, which he wrote early on, 1603. He talks about mirrors and lenses. The important thing is this. Let's go back to the discussion of Popper, and then I'll show you how it's relevant.
Okay.
Popper says that science proceeds, late in life, Popper says, science proceeds by a method of taking up a problem and giving it solution, and then finding a difficulty for the theory, which gives you a new problem, and then providing a solution, right? So now this is fine, but he doesn't tell you how the problem is to be found except by refuting the hypothesis. A hypothesis, error, and then a new trial. He doesn't tell you what else is there in a problem. What Bacon does is to show you how the problem should be constructed. And the construction of a problem is independent of the theory that you happen to be working on. It depends instead on what you think is true, quite independent of what you're working on. And what you do is you find all the difficulties that exist for that rest of your knowledge in order to get a handle on what your theory must explain. So it creates, you might say, the problem is structured in such a way that when you solve it, your theory is not just a hypothesis, but a unique solution. That's the, logically speaking, that's the important thing about Bacon. Popper's theory is a theory of conjectures and refutation. Each refutation gives you a way of getting conjectures, a way of generating conjectures. But the conjectures are, to think of it in terms of epistemology, they are coherent wholes, but you can have multiple coherent ways of describing phenomena, and you don't know which one is right. But Bacon's great insight was to suggest that if you construct your problems properly, if you get your problems constructed with sufficient, so that they present sufficient difficulty, then a unique solution becomes the only way you can solve it. And once you know that the solution is unique, now you have a reason for saying that you might say, constellation of hypotheses, which you use to understand, to make sense of the phenomena, is the unique one possible. It's the only one. The main difficulty for coherence theories of truth, or coherence theories of belief, is that coherence is not unique. But in Bacon's case, he says you construct it in such a way that your theories are unique, uniquely true. Because if you take any other hypothesis and try and explain the same set of errors, the same constellation of difficulties, you'll find it doesn't work. And that's why, if you apply it, you get something on which you can rely upon. It's stable. Now, he doesn't say it's absolutely true, because now I'll come to the question of mirrors. Mm. Every perception of the world is a distortion of something that you see. Every conception of the world is a distortion of something of which you think. And every idea you have is like that. He gets this from Plato in the Theaetetus. If you assume that every one of our inputs, of whatever kind, are distortions, then how do you ever find out what reality is? And his main idea is that if you have one grand distortion and you try and find it out, you can't, because you're trapped within it. That's you might say, the way you see the world. But when you have multiple distortions, what happens is that each distortion is different from another, and it trips up the other. So if, for instance, you may have a distortion, you may see a stick which is bent in the water, but you also have a theory of optics to deal with it. You also have various maneuvers. You can walk around it to see how the stick looks. You can also have operations like picking the stick up and putting it back in, examining it. When you have multiple ways of doing it, then what happens is that one error is shown up by another error. And typically, in the case of difficult things all those difficult questions of chemistry or physics, he dealt mainly with chemistry, but also with physics. What happens is that the errors which trip each other up multiply until you have a mess and you don't know which way to turn. He calls it a maze. And he says, in this situation, if you concentrate, don't ask what's the nature of reality. Don't ask is the universe one or many. Those grand questions take you you have to have imagination has to have leaden wings, have leaden weight, not wings. What you have to do is just look at these features and ask, why is it that in this situation, things appear to me in this way? And if you do that, you will discover that there is a solution, a way of construing all the things in that way in a model, what he calls it a schematism, in which all these errors disappear and you see an underlying reality which appears to you sometimes this way and sometimes that. And it is that insight which is unique, because now if you try any other theory, it can't explain why you see the errors that you do, because only your theory has worked on getting it right. But he also asks, what if there are two such theories that get it right? Well, if you do, then you have to find more cases. This is what he calls the finger post. If you get to a point where the road forks and you don't know which way to go, you pause and do more experiments, and then until you get a unique solution.
I must ask a question at this point. And I think you mentioned this in your article as well at some point as well. And this is a naive type of question, but I think it does beg asking. That all sounds incredibly exhausting in some ways. This building of a Baconian natural history of seeking out all these other distortions before you get around to doing it, but to be before you get around to discovering or solving any problems that you actually have. It sounds like an endless, or it is endless in some ways, but an exhausting, depressing almost process where you get wrapped up in this web and you may lose your faith in the process altogether.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, during his lifetime, it's not clear if anyone followed him. He proposed a social organization of science. He suggested that it should be built like Solomon's house. What was his word for it? You have 12 people doing this, 50 people doing that, 100 people doing the other. And so you would have like an army of people under the government working to extract as much reality as they could, as faithfully as they could, knowing that as they discovered more, they may have to review their earlier conclusions. So you're constantly changing it. But you would, at each stage, you would get a better and better grasp of it. The question is this ever really possible? Can we ever go through a natural history and come out at the other end with a solution which is unique? That's the question, right? Mm-hmm. That's another way of asking the question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now, the history of this is interesting, is that no one thought Bacon's ideas were anything more than a pipe dream while he was alive. As far as I know, it's possible that William Harvey thought that he was, but William Harvey had nothing good to say about Bacon's ideas, so probably didn't have an influence on it. But no one that I know during his lifetime actually started a Baconian program. But in any case, Bacon had grand ideas about organizing the philosophers together in a band. But after he died, and after Descartes had Galileo and then Descartes had put forward an alternative theory that we look for certainty, we look for it in mathematics, and we derive fundamentally the fundamental nature of the world in mathematical terms. In Descartes' case, not entirely mathematically, you start with a cogito and then go on to describe the physical world in a mathematical way. When that program foundered, ran into trouble, then the Royal Society took up the Baconian method, because that's the only other method other than Aristotle, which had been discredited. So that's how he took it up. And the story that I tell in my book, the second of my two books in draft form, is that Newton does it. And it's after Newton that people start saying, oh, wonderful, now we have a method which can find out about the world. And Newton does it in two cases. In the first case, in optics, where he shows the paradoxical thing that white light is a mixture of colors. It's unexpected. No one would think that a mixture of colors would give you white light, but he shows that. And he shows how it solves the Baconian natural history of optics, which he hadn't constructed. He had constructed one or two bits of it. A lot of it was known. That is to say, other people had discovered paradoxes, but they had not paid attention to them. And he explains all of them so that his theory becomes really quite powerful. And then he does the same thing in the Principia, where he takes the almost insoluble problems of the Copernican debate, what look like insoluble problems. How would you ever judge how to go about resolving these difficulties? Is how most people felt. So they would stick to one thing and say, let me prove this theorem, and let me prove that. As for the whole thing, we don't know. And what Newton does is give a theory of universal gravitation and a detailed mathematical analysis, which solves all the difficulties that were there. And the person who notices this is Christian Huygens. Mm. He, in his, Newton admired him very much. And I don't know if he sent it to anyone else, but he bought a copy of his own book, which had been published, and sent it to Christian Huygens. And Huygens in his Marginalia says, and I'll quote from memory, that he says, with Newton's theory, Mr. Newton's theory has dissolved all, what's the word? It's translated as has removed all the difficulties and has banished all the difficulties, and also has banished the Cartesian vortices. Now, forget the Cartesian vortices, because he thought another kind of vortex would work. But the remark that he had banished all the difficulties is important. Newton suddenly shows all kinds of strange things which people couldn't make sense of. Odd things about gravitation, about the moon, about the tides, and all of them suddenly made sense. And if it didn't make sense, you could apply Newton's theory a little further, and then it made sense. So it has this structure that Bacon predicted for it. And so in the 18th century, the Cartesians had to concede that Newton's theory had something special about it. So you find Daniel Bernoulli and Jean d'Alembert, who were both great mathematicians in the 18th century, and they understood Newton's method as Baconian method. They appreciated how he had somehow found a principle which resolved all the difficulties. Now, if you ask, why was Newton's theory not true? You know that. No. Why then was it so stable for 300 years?
That was going to be my next question, yes.
Yeah, and the answer is that the difficulties that he resolves come back if you take any other hypothesis. If you choose a new hypothesis to try and explain one set of phenomena, another set of phenomena come and bite you because he can't resolve the difficulties. It's only when Einstein comes forward, eventually in his general theory of relativity, in which he shows how the special theory and Newton's theory are approximations to his, which means that the set of puzzles that he looks at, the problems, the set of difficulties, encompasses those of the 17th century. So when he solves his, he's also solving the 17th century puzzles. And that's what makes for the effect of a kind of babushka doll in science, that, the later theories seem to encompass the earlier theories in some way.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. I was going to ask just about that then, because so a naive Popperian question here again, just to preempt some people listening, they may be thinking to themselves, what is the difference here? So if you have a theory and you build up your natural history and you write and you create and you do you have your observations and you do your experiments and you carefully note down all the conditions and all the results, and you get something that is a repeatable experiment. And then it is, as you just mentioned there with Newton, it turns out to be false in some ways. And if it's always open to error here, it sounds incredibly Popperian in some ways.
Well, in a way, yes. Very Popperian. It's very fallibilist, if that's what you mean. Popper was a fallibilist. It's Popperian in the sense that it's fallibilist.
Yes.
It's not Popperian in the sense that Bacon distinguishes between speculation and apparent knowledge. And Popper doesn't make that distinction.
Go, please, yeah.
When Einstein proposes the special theory of relativity, you can look upon it as a speculation. But once he's used it to derive the Newtonian mechanic, you might say the good consequences of Newtonian mechanics from his theory, it has ceased to be a mere speculation. Now it's a solution to all the problems that Newton also dealt with. And so it has a very special place. We've become very enamored of such a doctrine, which not only gives you new theories, new solutions to, basically the problem of why light is appears to have the same velocity to all observers, that plus all the problems that are solved on Newton's theory. This is the remarkable feature of science. Whereas if you take a hypothesis, Popper's description of it, now Popper's aware of this, he knows this, he's very concerned about it. But Popper's description of conjectures and refutation doesn't say how one conjecture is related to an earlier conjecture. Because if you refute a conjecture, what have you learned? That the conjecture is false, that's all. But when you learn that what you thought you knew before is false, then there remains a question. Why did that theory, which appeared to you to be true, now appear to you be false. What is it that made it look distorted to you then, and which you see right now? And that insight is what you get as you propose the scientific theory.
Now, you head this off a little bit in your article, but all of that, the answer for many people, many Popperians listening, will be thinking the answer to what you've said there is, and this sounds a little bit Baconian, as you were saying there, is I might ask this question a couple of ways. An answer to what you said there might be verisimilitude. And was Bacon, I know he didn't use the term, was there a sense of verisimilitude in Baconian theories, the idea of a new theory solving more problems as well as the old problems? It has more truth content in some way. So I might open up that question for your verisimilitude here and how it may or may not apply.
Yes, let's look at verisimilitude, and let's look at Bacon's substitute for verisimilitude. He has a substitute for it. And that substitute is called power over nature. Verisimilitude is introduced in chapter 10 of Popper's Conjectures and Refutation because Popper's worried. Here is a problem Popper's worried about. Let's suppose we are studying something like angels, and you have a theory and I have a theory. I refute yours, you refute mine, then you come up with one and I come up with another. The trouble is there's theory about angels, and let's say there are no angels. We could continue arguing about angels forever, refuting each other, without ever finding out that there are no angels. Refuting a theory doesn't mean you find out the truth. All it means is that you found out you're not now in error. And that's not enough. So Popper suggests that there's something more needed, that science actually gets at something in the world. So he proposes that it is possible for two false theories to be such that one gets at more about the world itself than another false theory. So if you take two false theories like Kepler and Newton, and you say, well, Kepler had a hypothesis, Newton had a hypothesis, and it turns out they were both mistaken. All right, then why did we prefer Newton over Kepler? And why do we refer to Newton in a more, as more dependable as a description of reality, the solar system, than we do Kepler? And Popper, you might say, invented a whole new way of thinking about it. He was a very inventive, one of the very great creative philosophers of the 20th century. And he invented this new way in Tarskian terminology of comparing the truth content of two theories and showing that the truth content of one may be greater than the truth content of the other, and the falsity content less, so that of two theories, one may in fact, in some theoretical sense, you can't check that this is true, but that it is possible for one theory to be more like the truth than another. And then he goes on to say, then what indication do we have that we are getting there? So the first is just a possibility. Now the difficulty is that possibility fails. It turns out, for rather trivial reasons, that if a theory is false, it will not have more true consequences than another theory that is false. That can be shown with simple propositional calculus. It's amazing. And once that goes down, you can find more complicated solutions. And I discussed this with Popper in Vienna when we were at a conference. And he said it's true. He says he conceded that he had not been able to solve the problem. But he said, if I haven't solved the problem, somebody else can. I don't rule out the possibility. And I said, yes, but supposing eventually people find 5 functions which have this property that you're looking for, and they're different, and you have 5 series of verisimilitude. I said, but it still doesn't mean anything. It's just you found a function which has this, and you don't know which function is right. So what's the point? Where does it get you? So he says, no, you don't understand. It's important that we know that there's a possibility for some theory to get reality better than another. At least that possibility must exist. Well, Bacon had his own theory of verisimilitude, and people have not understood it because they haven't paid attention to Bacon's program. It's called power over nature. And power over nature is not about human beings. Well, it is about human beings gaining their dominion, which they lost when he thought Adam had been cast from paradise. It is partly that. But the way Bacon construes it, he says that the task of philosophy can't be to discover the truth. Simply discover the truth. Because that's what Adam was trying to do. And we know that Adam got into trouble for that. You can't love truth for truth's sake. That was the mistake of the Greeks, Plato, for instance. He says, as Christians, we must realize that the task of philosophy and of all our lives is charity. So the task of philosophy must be to find a way to gain dominion over nature so that we can alleviate the suffering of others. And therefore, that the mark of a scientific theory should be that it gives us power over nature. I'm sorry, my throat is...
It's absolutely fine.
I don't have COVID. This is just a lecturing problem. Let me take a drink of water.
Please.
Now, what he proposes, he doesn't do it very systematically, but in the second book of the Organon, New Organon, he gives you a number of hints about how it's done. And I've tried to put it together in a simple format, which I'll explain to you. When you find errors and you are asked to note them down in the natural history, one of the things he asks is to write down the conditions under which these errors are made. He doesn't call them errors. When you have a phenomenon to describe, you set down the condition. And since these are experiments, or called the observations or experiments, in the case of observations, you say under what conditions you observed, and in the case of experiments, how you conducted the experiment to observe what you did. And the point of this is that somebody else then must be able to replicate them. And that has come to us as a kind of feature of modern science, that experiments have to be replicable. But there's a reason why Bacon says this, which we've forgotten. The reason why we have to have them replicated is because they give you power over nature. And this is how it happens. Let's suppose you have a list of conditions, list of errors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And these are observed under conditions C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C8, correlated. So you do this, you get this error, you do that, you get that error. When you've solved all this and you've got a single model which can explain why things appear to you distorted in the way they did, when they did, when you have that model, a coherent picture which solves all the difficulties all at once, you have a correlation between the condition and the error. How the error is just how the object appears to you in a distorted way. In another situation appears to you in another way. So you know the condition under which it appears to you this way, and you know the condition in which it appears to you that way. So now, if you want to produce the first kind of error, the first kind of distortion, you know which condition produces it. And if you want the second kind of distortion, you know the second kind of condition. Now, if you call each distortion an effect and each condition a cause, then you have basically a causal analysis of the phenomenon you're studying. And what Bacon says about this is power over nature is a pledge that you've got the truth about reality. In the past, people gave high-flown hypotheses, and if they are false, you learn nothing. But in this case, by extracting the schematism, you know how to manipulate the thing. You know that you have got hold of the thing itself because you know how to manipulate it to get the effects that you want. That's the theory of power of a nature. Now, this is you might say, a low-level version of verisimilitude. Popper's a high-flown level of all theories. And his point is the Baconian theory of power of a nature is that power of a nature is limited to a very limited set of things that we study now. But if we are multiplying this and do, say, 15 or 20 of these schematisms, we'll get power of a nature of a great many things, but we won't know the truth about them because there will be more distortions in each model. There are always more distortions than we know. So we may have solved the problem for n distortions, but there may be twice as many as n distortions, which we haven't even begun to look at. So we know that we're getting somewhere, that we've got hold of the thing itself, because we can manipulate it. But it doesn't mean we've got hold of God's truth, what he calls the idea, which is called God's truth. It may still have idols in it, idola, as Plato said.
I must ask about that because, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, probably am. That implies that in some ways Bacon isn't searching for a bedrock, but some of what, at least my reading of this, is it appears that he's searching for a bedrock of a kind. He wants to get out of that deductive infinite regress, and perhaps induction of this kind, of the Baconian kind, is a way to start from first premises in some way. So is Bacon searching for bedrock here? Is it possible, or does he think this is something that can't be found?
He thinks that Aristotle makes a mistake by looking for it. That's his complaint about Aristotle. He says, what Bacon says about Aristotle, it seems that he has found the bedrock. But when you examine it, he uses language. And language uses words. And words relate to notions, or what we call meanings. And he says these are distorted. They reflect our current erroneous understanding of the world. So why would you expect to hit bedrock using the language that we have, which is mistaken? So that's his complaint about all theories of looking for bedrock, is that we don't have a language in which to describe it. So you might say the task of philosophy is to build up both the puzzles to solve and the language in which to describe it. So our language also has to change with this, because the old language will be inadequate to describe the reality that you're just discovering. The old language will be one of those mirrors, distorting mirrors, which you have to correct as you go along. It's surprising how close this is to 20th century concerns about theory-latenness of language and so on. To him, there's nothing. This is just like the beginning. It's in the first few sections of the New Organon, first few aphorisms, aphorism 9 and 10 and 12. He says this, that the trouble with language is that we rely on our pre-existing way of cutting up the world. And that when we cut up the world one way, we fail to see its true divisions. And he says the task of science is not to make the world conform to our mind, the measures of our mind, as he put it, but rather to make our mind conform to the measures of reality.
Now, Thomas Kuhn, and I think you're critical of him, well, in part in your work on this, he talks about language in this way, and he goes back to Wittgenstein and uses his philosophy. I believe it's to do with incommensurability. So how does that fit into the picture? Is this a similar structure to what Bacon is talking about?
Well, I think what is similar to both they both accept, all the moderns. There was a period in the middle when the logical positivists thought that language has a certain kind of very special sacrosanct feature, namely a sort of transparent look at the world. But most of the later thinking on this has been that our language is distorting or can be distorting. The problem is, how do we get out of the distortion? And there is no easy answer to that, because once you are using a language, you seem to be trapped in it. And Kuhn suggests that you can do it. What you do is you give in to language at any one time, and you adopt, you might say, a certain language, and then you use it to investigate nature to the fullest, using that style of those concepts. Also the experimental apparatus, the mathematics, all that together. And by concentrating, you get certain facts, which we admire science for extracting. And he says, if you do this in a systematic way, so that at any one time, you throw out all philosophical speculation, just adopt a view and go down to it. The trouble is that he claimed that this is a description of the history of science, and that in fact, this is what happened. So you have Newtonian physics, and then you have Einsteinian physics or quantum physics. Then you have one kind of biology and another kind of biology. His theory of revolution and normal science, extraordinary science and normal science, with revolutions coming during extraordinary science, has caught the imagination of people, but they haven't actually don't actually look at the history to see if it's so. It follows a model. The model in history, in his standard sort of school book history, is a rise and fall model. The rise of Genghis Khan and the fall of his dynasty, the rise and fall of Rome, so you look at Kuhn's history of science, and it looks like an intellectual model of that kind of history. But it happens within the scientific group, so when the political winds change, he calls that a revolution. Now, my first difficulty with that is that you look at the history of science, it does not seem to me to be periodized in that way. It's a lot messier than that, and in some ways a lot clearer than that. I mean, both. So if you ask Newtonian science, what is the place of Michael Faraday in Newtonian science? Was he a normal scientist? Was he a normal, any kind of scientist? Normal chemical scientist? Normal? I don't think so. It doesn't make sense. He was one of the most, I mean, personally, he may not have been like Popper in many respects, but he was creative in the way, but in so many different fields, as I found Popper to be when I met him. In so many different fields, he was very creative. He was certainly nothing like a normal scientist who would take given problems and just solve them using techniques that other people had endorsed. In fact, he was a loner. He used to work in the Royal London Institution, and everybody used to wonder where he got all these ideas. Even his best friend said that he was a great experimenter, but don't trust his ideas, John Tyndall. The problem with the Kuhnian hypothesis is that, I mean, Kuhn's theory of periodization is that in many normal scientific, so-called normal scientific periods, you have great innovation taking place, which pops up as a new theory or a new paradigm 100 years later. So Faraday invents fields, what we call fields in physics. And Maxwell uses his electromagnetic constant experiments to develop a theory of light. And then Einstein uses his theory of fields to describe the space-time afterwards. This is extraordinary. How does that fit into Kuhn's periodized picture of the rise and fall of Newtonian physics? And then I point out furthermore in my paper, which we are discussing, that Newton's theory was not the way Kuhn describes revolutions. In Kuhn's theory of revolutions, new paradigms come up when all discussion is about fundamentals. It's all philosophical. Nobody has any rules about how to do things. Everyone's questioning each other. And so the new paradigm then becomes a magnet to bring order into the community. That's not what Newton did. And it's not me, but you read any work on Newton, and you'll see he was a great mathematician. He was also an experimental philosopher. When he published the Principia, everybody, but Leibniz, Christian Huygens, all the Cartesians in Paris, all the commentators in Germany, and certainly all the English commentators, they all acknowledged that his work was a great piece of mathematics, because it was. He used Euclidean geometry, Apollonius' theory of Berger, his theory of conic sections, and made certain elegant proofs about how planets would behave under various circumstances. And these developed in a kind of majestic way, starting with the simplest to the more complicated, until his mathematical models are pretty close to describing, not quite enough, but pretty close to describing various features of the solar system. Now, this is a feat of what, if you read Kuhn dispassionately, is a case of normal science, because the rules are well laid out. The rules of geometry are laid out since Euclid's time. What is a good solution is well known. Everyone knows it, and everyone acknowledges it. No, not one philosopher. Well, there are some errors in his mathematics. Two theorems have proofs which are, you might say, questionable. The theorems are okay, and they're proved later. Daniel, we. So there are, you might say, it's not that he's perfect, but rather that his solutions to the problems that he proposed, puzzle solving, is superb. And it's the superbness of his puzzle solving that makes it such a great contribution, because then in book 3, which is not mathematical, it is mathematical, but not as mathematical, when he starts talking about the phenomena, he banishes all the difficulties, as Christian Huygens notes. So first you have this brilliant mathematical treatment in book 1 and book 2 of Principia. And then in book 3, he basically takes things which previously were thought to be mysterious, strange. No one knew what they were. I mean, I'll give you one example. May I?
Mm-hmm. Yes, please, yeah.
Take the so-called pendulum, the Seconds pendulum. It was invented by, the very idea was invented by Christian Huygens, and he wrote a book on it called On the Pendulum, which in the second part of it, which is theoretical. The first part was just a description of the pendulum. The second part of it, he has a theoretical description, which is probably as close to Newton's Principia as anyone did work before Newton published his Principia. In his Seconds pendulum, what you do is you calibrate the length, which is all that matters, in such a way that it swings exactly 1 second going one way and 1 second going the other way. And if you don't extend the amplitude too much, which could distort it, if you do it in a limited time, you get a wonderful astronomical instrument for measuring time. And so this was supposed to be certainly a great instrument for astronomers. You could build a pendulum in Paris, and you could take it to Lyon, and then you could also take it to, and you could measure astronomical time everywhere. But they discovered to their shock that when you move the pendulum, the length has to be different to get exactly 1 second. Wait a minute. I thought Galileo said it's all about space and time. Doesn't depend on matter. Certainly doesn't depend on the letter on which the town begins. If it's Lyon, it has one length, and if it's Paris, it's another length. But then they discovered, this is all before Newton, just a couple of years before, a few years before Newton, they discovered that there's a dependency of the length for a 1 second pendulum on the latitude which you are. So at the North Pole coming down, the period would change, the length would change, or if you keep the length fixed, the period would change. This is also mysterious. Why? Why does it depend on where on Earth you are? And Newton explains that almost like a passing remark. I mean, it's not passing, it's a serious thing. But he shows two things. First, that the Earth is not a sphere. It's actually an oblate spheroid. So what he does is he assumes that the Earth is the Earth is spinning around the center. So we know that if the Earth is spinning around the center, then there is a centrifugal force, a force going away from the center, which is pulling the Earth apart around the equator. On the other hand, that force does not exist at the poles. We know that. Mm-hmm. We also know the rate at which the Earth spins, because people have known that. That's also the rate at which the sun goes around the Earth since antiquity. So we have a very good idea of, can calculate what the force is on the equator of this centrifugal motion. So doing a bit of a calculation, he shows that he calculates that the equator is about 17 miles high compared to the poles. It's like a mountain. The equator is like on a mountain, and the mountain is 17 miles high. How he does this is also interesting. I won't go into it, but it's very pretty. There's a certain elegance to Newton's thinking, which you don't get if you look at the mess he's dealing with. Everything is messy, but in that mess, he discovers an elegant little way to solve a problem. Anyway, that was Newton. Now, when you discover that, when he calculates that the circumference of the Earth around the equator is 17 miles more than from the poles, he then asks the question, what about the force of gravity? And of course, the force of gravity is distance dependent. So a body at the center of the on the pole and the body at the equator would be far away from would have different distances to the center of the Earth, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you calculate how that force would affect the fall of a body, you can then see that a second's pendulum at the pole and at the equator would have different effective forces upon them. And if you calculate this effective force, you can measure more or less accurately how the second's pendulum behaves as you move it from north to south. Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
I mean, when we talk about Newtonian theory giving you consequences which are true, that sounds so boring. You have a theory, you have initial conditions, you have consequences. But he explained something which was mysterious. No one could understand what it was. How can Galileo's pendulum depend on where you're measuring it? Galileo gives such a beautiful mathematical theory. And now you're depending on whether it's in Lyon or Paris. No, it turns out it is mathematical still, if you take gravitational force into account.
So you touched on it a bit there. How do you view, back to just on Kuhn there, how do you view his periodization and his social ontology? Is it, and you do touch on this, you bring in people like Feyerabend, and so how do you view that whole enterprise? Is it something that we should give up and imagine science being one large permanent revolution of a kind? Or because, as you've mentioned there, it is such a fraught exercise to try and draw hard lines between social enterprises and social movements and social ontologies.
It is. The way I see science developing is much more historical, and the pattern is not as, it doesn't replicate. It's like a mushroom growing. You see a mushroom and it grows, but soon it starts taking a shape. And you couldn't have predicted the shape, but you might say somehow the shape was there. I don't know. In that case, of course, there are yeasts which have certain inner programs. In the case of science, it develops in response. So the way I see science as having developed is that in the 17th century, two great methods were proposed. Cartesian, which encompasses some ideas of Galileo's or expresses some ideas of Galileo's, and Bacon's. And they're both important for modern science. These two methods gave rise to a hybrid methodology, and people picked and chose what they wanted to use. But in the process, what they developed, if they used the Baconian method, are schematisms or models, concrete models of things which are not just general theories, but of things around the world, which are extremely effective at controlling nature. So we get a sense that we know, it's not infallibly, but we know what we are doing. We know how to handle things. If you want to do things, we can get them done because we know what things to control to get them done. This is all philosophy. Although it has this, it looks like science, it's all philosophy. Sometime in the 19th century, something happened. The number of different models dealing with things on Earth, chemistry, physics, biology, started multiplying. All these models being, you might say, fallible knowledge. And we started getting a much better handle on many of the things that we normally dealt with. I call this, in my book, I call this density of knowledge. It's apparent knowledge. We may change our mind in the future. But we get to understand it so well that we no longer need to keep checking. We know how to handle it. Of course, there are many things that we still don't know how to handle in the same way. I'll give you an example and you'll see what I mean.
Okay.
In the pandemic, they discovered that, first of all, they discovered that what was causing the problem was a virus. And then they were able to decode the virus, find out the RNA, which constitutes the virus. You know, this took about 2 weeks in China. I mean, they were scientists. 2 weeks. Then we started looking for a vaccine. The vaccine, the mRNA vaccine that they found, took a couple of weeks. But it took us several months to know whether it's safe and whether it's effective. And it was not, whereas our knowledge about the virus, do we ask how many thousand viruses did they check their views on? No. We know that they know that it's a virus. We know that they know it's RNA. How we know that, I don't know, but we do. Everyone trusts it. No one questions that. The question about which vaccine will work is much more fraught with difficulty because we don't know. And there's the difference. Knowledge density means that you have not just one, but a dozen models, maybe 30 models. I haven't done a count. All of which work reasonably well and which work with each other to describe things. So if you're building a plane, you can call upon somebody who does metals, another person who does aerodynamics, another person who does weather predictions, and so on. All sorts of people together, and together you produce the plane, which takes you relatively safely, more safely than a car, I'm told, from one place to another. This knowledge density gave us what we call modern science. Not Newton, that was natural philosophy. They didn't naturally philosopher, they were philosophers. But when these philosophers produced models which gave us such predictable results, and they're all in related areas close together, then we get this kind of knowledge density. And we have this knowledge density now in certain biological aspects. We know how to analyze things. We know a great deal about ourselves. Not enough, I mean, it's a speck in the ocean. But what we know well enough that we can manipulate the things that fall under it to get the results we want.
Is that knowledge density inherently more convincing to people? So if you had more knowledge density at the other level, where it comes to which vaccine to take, and the point in that scene you're drawing there, where there is debate and argument, if there was more knowledge density, there'll be less inherent debate.
Well, there is, when there is knowledge density, people very quickly get to the point. And then the question of, there are still questions about the fundamental, you might say, concepts of the theory, which are discussed. They may be discussed in another forum somewhere in a university where they talk about abstract things. And that may improve our understanding, let's say, of viruses. But because we are going from apparent knowledge to more realistic apparent knowledge, to still more realistic apparent knowledge, if you use the Baconian method, not the other method, but Baconian method. When we find that we made a mistake about viruses, and we made a mistake about, nucleic acids, we are not going to go back and ask whether heredity depends on nucleic acids or not. That, you might say, is unlikely to happen. We're not going to go back to homunculus theories of birth. There's a kind of progress, and the progress is that the density of knowledge becomes great enough that we can manipulate. So we know that we've got hold of something. We know what we are dealing with in a practical sense. And for that reason, when somebody puts forward a new theory, it can't be wildly off radar. It has to cover all the difficulties that were once solved in the field. You have to be able to solve them with your new theory. That's very difficult.
Do those new theories, so I might tie this together here, back to Popper's answer to this verisimilitude. Do those new theories, in your opinion, tie in to Popper's 3 new criteria? I'll read them out here. So he goes on and he says, this new good theory should proceed from some new, simple, powerful, unifying idea. Second, it should be independently testable, which is a challenging one. And third, a good theory must pass new and severe tests.
Yes, you might say that Popper gives us the criteria, not just of a new theory, but a new theory of method. Your method must allow you to show you how you get unified theories with independent tests, and how they pass it. You must get all 3. Instead of saying, what must a new theory have, which is what Popper does, which is right. I mean, he is looking at the new theory. You can translate that, and I did eventually, as a requirement for what a method must do. If you have a method and it is any good at all, it must show how you're following a method. You would get unified theories, how you would get independently testable theories, or independent tests of theories which they pass. Now, my claim is, I don't make it here, but elsewhere, that Bacon's theory actually does exactly those 3 things. Take the unification. When you have multiple errors of a thing, let's say of astronomy, you have lots of facts, Kepler, Galileo, Pascal, and they're all going out and discovering all kinds of strange factual and mathematical things. Nobody knows what to make of them. When you solve them, you have in fact unified all the phenomena that they're talking about into one theory. So the pendulum, the second's pendulum, and the shape of the Earth, and the motion of the Earth around the sun are all under one theory. The fact that the moon and the earth fall at the same rate, the moon and an apple fall at the same rate, is also part of that theory. Also, the fact that the moon shows its face all the time towards the earth, that is explained by Newton with what's called tidal locking. And then there are dozens of other smaller experiments, all of which were puzzling on the whole, what to make of it. Now you have a scheme in which all of this seems to work. So you have unified it. So the first is easily answered. A Baconian natural history begs for a unifying solution. And every solution which works is independently testable because it has something which was, you might say, a possible refutation of it. Every theory is refuted by one side or the other of two conflicting hypotheses. And of course, it passes it because the schematism passes it. So the three criteria that Popper gives are generated by a Baconian method.
Now, as I'm painfully aware of how long I've kept you here, it's just so interesting to me here. But I must ask you a final question on the matter. And it will be a little broad in scope a little here. But why do you imagine that that there's such a profound split has happened in philosophy between those who found inductive reasoning valuable and those who have not? Because it seems to become a litmus test of a kind, and it really is this hard dividing line that has run through philosophy. So what do you imagine is the reasoning for all of this?
I don't know how I'm going to answer that easily.
Well, I may offer your own words just as an interesting thing, because I found these words of yours quite humorous. You're talking about Thomas Kuhn, and you're talking about paradigms that were Baconian paradigms. And you write, if he was in a more rebellious mood, he may have gone back a bit further, and he may have concluded, this is a quote, he may have concluded that another source of Baconian science, surprisingly enough, is to be found in Bacon's own writing. So is it a problem that people are not understanding the nuances of Baconian science and the nuances of induction, perhaps?
Yes. Bacon has been interpreted as an empiricist. If you interpret him as an empiricist, then Baconian puzzles are impossible because you have somehow used an insecticide and all those little bugs are gone. And then you say, what bugs? There are no bugs here. That's because you use empiricism, takes all kinds of experiences and says, let's find the data in here. And once you found the data, the given, it has no puzzles left. So now, if you take data as puzzle-free, then all you can do is study its theory or its interpretation. Or in other words, you get the hypothetical deductive method as the only possible way to proceed. Now, if you assume that the hypothetical deductive method is the only way to proceed, and this was a conclusion reached by the Cartesians late in the 70s, that was reached by people like Christian Huygens and Blaise Pascal and Antoine Arnaud late in the 17th century, then you can have mathematical truth, but it doesn't reflect reality. It doesn't reflect reality enough, if it does. But then all the other things that you know seem to be up in the air. Does the earth move? Who knows? Galileo was sent to prison for this, but science can't say. Well, it turns out that Blaise Pascal suggests a solution, namely that within the group of things that we can't prove on the Cartesian method, there are some things which may be more probable than others. And then he uses gaming to explain how probability is this. So if you assume the Cartesian method, or equivalently the empiricist method, which is a variation on Descartes' method, you have a gap between theory and what you observe. So if you insist that what you observe must be pure, trustworthy, a foundation, bedrock, then it has no problems. And therefore, Bacon's method can't work on it. And once you take that view and apply it to all knowledge, you say, look, there must be a solution to the better theories being probable and the less good theories being improbable. There's nothing else which works. So it's an article of faith that it must be probability. And that, if you look at it, you say, could we just do with hypotheses? And Popper says, yes, we can do just with hypotheses. We don't need probability. And they say, but that we then don't have knowledge. We don't have any way of choosing the right hypotheses. And Popper says, yes, I mean, wake up. That's the world we live in. What can we do? This is a story. All the inductivists dislike Popper's theory because they think he's given in. He's given up the ghost for science. And Popper thinks that all these inductivists are whistling in the dark. They're hoping that somehow, somewhere, someone will come with a function, a probability function, which will rescue all the theories they like. So both sides find that the other side is acting somehow in a magical way. Both sides are looking for magic. There is no magic.
That is also a wonderful note to end the podcast on. I will link the article that we've been speaking about today below the podcast, as well as a place where you can go and read Jagdish's other works as well. And I will also link his book and his upcoming book as well. If there is a possible link, I'll put that down there as well. It was such a pleasure chatting, Jagdish. Thank you so much. I really did enjoy it. And I'm going to have to go back and listen through the podcast to pick up on all the puzzles and the points that I missed. But it was so fascinating. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jed. Thank you for even having me.